It is honestly a real pleasure and a huge privilege to welcome Jilozian from the Women's Support Center, based in Yerevan, traveling through the UK at the moment. I am going to, I suppose, share a little bit of what we're going to do. Ani's going to speak on the changing landscape of domestic violence in Armenia, and then we're going to transition into a bit of a moderated conversation. And then, of course, throughout the entirety of the event, we really encourage you all to send along your questions. And if you're in the audience, then please do ask your questions. And without further ado, I suppose, Ani, I will hit this for you. Mm-hmm. And then
Great. Thank you so much, Nana, for the introduction. And really, it's truly a pleasure to be here in good company. I feel the warmth and intimacy in the Armenian Institute. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us online as well. I'm going to talk today about three things. One, how we got started doing the work that we're doing at the Women's Support Center. Two, where we've come. And three, what lies ahead. So why did we get started? In 2010, a woman by the name of Zarui Bedrosian was brutally murdered by her husband. This set off a shockwave in Armenia. It was the first time that really anyone was publicly talking about domestic violence. Prior to that, it was thought to be an intimate family problem, something not to be shared publicly. At that point in time, there was little to no response from the state. And so when Zarui was murdered, it really shook everyone up in a way that it hadn't before. And feminist activists took to the streets and demanded for a response to this case and to domestic violence at large. Our director, Maro Matosyan, was one of those activists on the street in 2010. She understood that something had to be done about this issue, that there was little to no services at the time to address and reach out to women who were experiencing domestic violence, and nothing at an institutional level to stop the violence from continuing. So Maro went back to New Jersey, where she was also based, and got trained at the New Jersey Battered Women's Association. She learned international best practices and methodologies in domestic violence programming. And then she brought that back with her to Armenia, along with specialists to train our staff. When the Women's Support Center was founded in 2010, it was a small grassroots organization. The first year, we offered support to roughly 50 women and children who were experiencing domestic violence, and they received social services, counseling, and legal aid. I'm proud to tell you today that so much has changed over just a short period of time over the last 13 years. The Women's Support Center has grown to become the most professionalized and established center dealing with domestic violence in Armenia. We offer essential and comprehensive services that include counseling, social services, and legal aid. We also established a 24-hour hotline, 2 shelters, the only 2 domestic violence shelters in all of Armenia. And in addition to that, we offer educational and life-enhancing workshops for women. This includes workshops on domestic violence and safety planning, on parental skills and life skills training. And we also offer a successful economic empowerment program for women who have worked with our staff to overcome trauma and begin to reintegrate into society. These women are offered business and entrepreneurship training. Some of them go on to take vocational training, and some also establish their own small businesses and receive seed money and tools for their own startups from our center. But when Maro established the center back in 2010, she understood that by providing services to women and children, it wasn't addressing the bigger issue of domestic violence in society. And she knew that we needed to do more than that. So we not only have been providing essential services, at the same time, we work very, very heavily on changing knowledge and attitudes around domestic violence and violence against women more broadly in Armenian society. Starting in 2012, we were the first organization to use high-profile court cases to leverage media coverage of domestic violence cases. This was the first time really that domestic violence was even covered by the media. And slowly it began to grow. We gave public appearances, interviews, and also worked with other advocates in the field from the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women all together to promote awareness around domestic violence in Armenian society. And we've come a long way in that regard as well. Whereas before it was really a silent crime and very taboo to talk about. Now there's a general recognition that domestic violence exists in Armenia. And there's much less cultural tolerance of domestic violence as well than there used to be a decade ago. At the same time that we are working to provide services and to raise awareness about this issue, we also understood that we needed to do something at an institutional level to make sure that women and children victims of domestic violence across Armenia are offered more protection. So we've been working again with a handful of advocates in this field doing this work to lobby for domestic violence legislation since 2010. Finally, with the efforts of our center and a few others, we were able to pass a domestic violence law in 2017. This law is imperfect, and there are lots of gaps that I'll talk about a little bit later. But having a law in place really, it shows the message that domestic violence is something serious and needs to be taken seriously. And from there were more reforms that happened over time. And by 2020, the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs reached out to our center to take a leading role in establishing regional domestic violence centers all across Armenia. So this is something that we've done. We've trained all of the specialists in all 10 regions. There's 10 centers plus ours in Yerevan. We mentor them, we provide them with resources, and we also are very heavily focused on streamlining processes. So all of our intake forms, our risk assessment procedures, our database forms are all standardized and used by all the regional centers so that we look at domestic violence as a unified force and we address it in the same way to really standardize processes. This is everything we've done up until this point, and there's a lot that lies on the horizon. But to kind of give you a sense of how this affects everyday women in Armenia, I wanted to share with you Hasmik's story. Hasmik is from Gavar. She is a small town in the north of Armenia. She experienced horrifying abuse by her husband and by her mother-in-law for several years. Hasmik had 2 children with her husband. The first was born with a hearing disability as a result of the violence that she encountered in pregnancy. And she knew that it couldn't go on and that if she didn't put an end to the violence, that he would kill her. So after one particularly brutal episode, Hasmik fled in the middle of the night. She was by a river. She called her mother, and in the morning went to the hospital, called the police, and then they reached out to us. Hasmik came to our center dejected, depressed, unsure about what to do with her life, really at a loss for how to kind of pick up the pieces. By that point, her husband had never allowed her to work. She was never able to continue her education, which was something that she wanted to do. And so she truly was at a loss. And like many women who come to us, was depressed, anxious, had signs of PTSD, and had a lot of trauma to overcome. At the same time, she was also fighting a custody battle for her children, and that dragged on for more than 2 years. in the end, she was finally united with both of her children. Hasmik struggled a lot. She went through our economic empowerment program, started her own small business. Although her husband never allowed her to work, one thing she was very good at was cooking. And so she made desserts, sold it to supermarkets and small chains, and made ends meet that way. She also works with us at the center and offers a really important perspective to other survivors who she works with. And Hasmik has overcome a lot over this short period of time, and she continues to thrive. Recently, she went back to continue her education. Things are not easy for her. She has 2 aging parents and 2 children. She's the sole breadwinner in the household living in Yerevan. So life isn't easy, but she wakes up content, happy, living a life free of abuse, independently, making decisions for herself, and not constantly under the threat of violence. Hasmik is one of many thousands of women who have come through our center. In 2022 alone, we served around 1,000 women and children. So there's a lot that we're doing, and many survivors whose lives we're touching in the process. And so there are real people kind of behind the work that we're doing. I wanted to talk to you about how we've come all of this way, but the landscape is still changing. In 2020, COVID hit, and as you know, domestic violence rose dramatically across the world, and Armenia was no exception to this. When Armenia had its lockdown in March, we saw a huge spike in our hotline numbers and hotline calls because people were locked at home with abusive husbands and family members with absolutely no recourse because they were constantly being monitored in the home. Adding to this was the socioeconomic conditions worsening, and it really was, it set off a crisis. And so many women came to us for support at that time. And then later we had the war in Artsakh, which was devastating. And we know, and this is something that also happens worldwide, is that when there's war and conflict, it comes hand in hand with gender-based violence. We also saw a lot of reporting in this period of time in the post-war period. Our center pivoted immediately to address the issue. We became a distribution center, registered distribution center, and we were distributing goods, material goods. We were also giving counseling and shelter to displaced women and families who needed it, while at the same time continuing our daily scope of work, because a domestic violence center can't just shut down when there's a pandemic or a war. And so we continued in this very turbulent time. And our database numbers show kind of the impact of these multiple crises, because since 2020, we've had a doubling in case number. And more concerning, we've had a doubling in high-risk cases. Whereas before 2020, it was around 1 in 8 women who came to us when their lives were severely endangered. Now it's around 1 in 4. And many of these women and children require shelter support. So just last year alone, we offered shelter and safe houses to 200 women and children experiencing domestic violence for, on an average, a period of 2 to 3 months. So this is kind of where we're at now. We're in this post-war period. Things are still difficult. And I wanted to also share with you one positive trend, which is that women are not waiting as long to reach out for support now. So up until 2020, it was around, the average age of a woman coming to us was around mid-30s. And now, in just over the last few years, we've seen that drop. And on average, women come to us in their mid-20s, which is a huge difference. And it's really showing that women are not staying in abusive relationships as long. Before, they were staying upwards of 8, 10 or more years. Now they're breaking this cycle of violence earlier and coming out to us earlier. And what's more, we used to never see women in partnerships prior to marriage, and now we're seeing that. So we have a lot of concerning trends, but there is also something positive happening, which is women are not tolerating violence like they used to, and things are slowly changing. This is the case in Yerevan, where we're based, and some of the distant regions that are more conservative, don't have these same trends. But if we look at sort of generally across the board, we do see that women are approaching us when they're much younger now than they did before. I wanted to pivot and talk about where do we go from here. So I laid out what we do, the groundwork, the services that we provide, and some of the newer trends and developments. I wanted to also mention, I mentioned briefly that we had a domestic violence law that was adopted in 2017 and that it was flawed. I want to come back to that and say that last year, there were 3 members of parliament who came together to, along with other stakeholders from the ministry and with our expert advice, came together to create a package of legislative amendments. This is really a game changer for Armenia because it's the first time since 2017 that any major changes to legislation on domestic violence have taken place. And what this does is it's not just amendments to the domestic violence law itself, but also the criminal code and the family code as it relates to domestic violence. And what it does is a few things. One, definitions on domestic violence are better defined. So when these new amendments are adopted, which we're hopeful will be a little bit later this year, there will be better definitions around what intimate partner violence is, violence that ex-husbands perpetrate, and so forth. Stalking will also be better defined with these new amendments. And then there will also be a lot more protection mechanisms in place for women who seek support. So with these amendments, we'll see more free of charge medical care for victims, more shelter spaces that open up for victims as well. And while domestic violence is still not criminalized under Armenian law, with these new amendments, we'll have stricter measures around police warnings and intervention orders that are issued, which will send the signal that domestic violence is not something that can be tolerated. At the same time that we're helping to amend legislation, we're also working on policies and procedures around domestic violence. So our center last year worked with the police department to amend their procedures and internal orders around risk assessment. So now their risk assessment procedures mirror that of our centers, and they're better equipped to now assess the risk of danger to a victim when she comes to the police. So we're working kind of on a systems level to change things slowly, and they are changing. Despite all of the legal gaps, I could list to you 50 or 100 different legal gaps that still exist, but these changes are happening and we're going in a positive direction. Right now, the state is looking to roll out perpetrator programs. This is something that is very problematic. And as a feminist organization, as a women's organization doing this work, our stance is that perpetrator programs are indeed necessary if we want to break the cycle of violence, but it's too soon for Armenia because domestic violence is not criminalized, because there are not enough protections for women. We fear that the rollout of these perpetrator programs will be ineffective, and at worst, they can actually make the violence worse, because we know in this field that perpetrators often use enrollment in a perpetrator program as a bargaining chip to try to get back into relationships, and then the abuse continues that way. So we really have to approach this very carefully. And right now, the state's really pushing for it, and we're at this kind of turning point where we're not really sure what's going to happen with that. They did roll out a pilot program not too long ago, and we'll see where that goes and where it's headed. But that is something that is troubling to us at this point. I wanted to end by saying that in order to improve legislation, in order to make sure that everything is implemented properly, legislation, procedures, and practices around domestic violence, we need a unified approach. And this is also something that the Women's Support Center is advocating for and working toward, which is building a coordinated community response that brings together a multi-agency response with criminal justice sector, education, healthcare, the ministries, and everyone who's involved and deals with domestic violence in some capacity to really come together and to collectively decide that we're putting an end to violence and taking very actionable, specific steps to do so. Because in the end, we all want to see a democratic Armenia where violence is no longer tolerated and where the cycle of abuse is broken in a society which is egalitarian and harmonious. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much for being so attentive, and thank you to those who are joining us online. We can open now to the Q&A, and I'd be happy to continue this conversation with you. And I want to say that if anyone is interested in engaging with our center, please feel free to reach out to me and we can talk more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking what we could do is transition down here and move this away. So those who are joining us online, bear with us for just a moment. So we'll go ahead and pop this off. I'll also transition out of this share and have us here. And again, Ani, thank you for coming, and thank you all for coming. It's hard to listen to something like this because, as you mentioned, there are these big leaps and bounds, but there's also some of these challenges that continue. So I wanted to start actually by giving some context of how we met, because in my mind, you're so associated with this issue because in 2015, I was volunteering in Armenia, and the Women's Support Center was working very closely with the Women's Resource Center. And so all of the volunteers were invited to essentially go along on one of the trials to support a woman with her two children. I remember this so clearly in Lodi.
And not only to support her, but at that time, and still now, there aren't protections for women in the courthouse. And so a woman who is a victim of domestic violence may see her perpetrator in the hall, in the waiting room, right there. And we were doing it as, to support her, but also as a security measure to make sure that she was safe.
I'm happy that you said that, because I was going to ask you, you talked about essential services, and then you talk about something that is like this, which could be seen as symbolic, but then also has this very functional purpose. Because what I remember most about this is it took hours to get there. When we got there, the scene at that courthouse was catastrophic. The family, I remember, was literally jumping under the wheels of the bus so that we wouldn't leave, and pulling the children. And it was like a proper scuffle. And the police were doing nothing. They were just looking at us like, and it shocked me. It really did shock me. And it really was, I think I said this to you, you were translating some of the kind of legal language around this. And I thought to myself, well, this is the first time I'm so pleased that I don't understand Armenian fluently, because some of this stuff is so horrific. But I wanted to ask a little bit more about, from 2015, I suppose, from when you were initially, even before then, studying this as a public health issue, right? You did a Fulbright focused on this, correct? Could you talk a little bit about the way that people have been studying this, or the infrastructure around that, of the understanding of what domestic violence is?
There's not a lot of good research, I have to say, on domestic violence. We have a few nationwide household surveys. Household surveys are widely used in the field, not of domestic violence, but more generally, right, to collect information. They're very useful. But if you think about domestic violence and the intricacies of that, you're essentially inviting a surveyor into someone's home where they're experiencing abuse and asking them whether they're experiencing abuse. And even if you get a woman in a room alone to do this, she's much less likely, right, to report that she's experiencing domestic violence. So we have these household surveys, which are kind of the best that we have right now. And even they are showing that upwards of 1 in 3 women are experiencing psychological violence. 1 in 8 across Armenia are experiencing physical violence. And we know even that is an underreporting of the true figure. But we don't, one of the issues we have in this field and kind of more generally is that we don't have good disaggregated data by age and sex. And so when we're looking at issues around violence, we can't figure out, what is what. So I'll give you an example. When the work on recently on the femicide report, right? It's very hard to understand what is a homicide that is, related to domestic violence, and what isn't, like, based on these records that we have, right? So we don't have a good picture really about domestic violence and the scope of it.
Do you find that women are now, you mentioned some of the changes that people are reporting earlier, that women are not staying in relationships or are not even married to the partners that they are experiencing this violence at the hands of? Do you sense that there's also been kind of a media culture shift around, the way that relationships are portrayed in Armenian media? I remember a while back there was a bit of an uproar about kind of a comedy skit where a wife is beaten, and that was completely portrayed as comedy. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, there has been a shift. Of course, there's still a lot of soap operas and shows that portray violence against women. The Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women was very had an important role here, because they really advocated to get rid of these soap operas. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that there was one particular one that was taken out, or there were things taken out of it as a result of that advocating and lobbying. So people stepping up to challenge the status quo really can have an impact. But generally speaking, there are still very, images of women being violated on TV, and also just in textbooks. Gender inequality is so palpable. You see pictures of a little girl sweeping, or a boy, riding his bike. And this is what our youth are seeing, and this is what they're growing up to believe. And those gender stereotypes and gender norms are really solidified. So if we want to work to tackle gender inequality and violence against women, we really have to start at the root of it, which is education, and also the household, but what they're receiving from society.
Right. I do want to open it up to questions, and I see that folks in the chat have been writing, but I did want to preference if anyone here has a question, or we'll shift to the chat. So Mariana writes, in Brazil, there are specialized police stations for domestic violence. Do you think that this is something that can be done in Armenia? And if we see a situation where there's violence against women, how can we denounce it in an efficient way?
Yeah. So as of 2013, there are police departments specifically dealing with domestic violence cases, and we've worked very closely with that police department since its founding. The police response is far from perfect, but we've seen huge progress in this regard as well. Whereas before, they were much more likely to kind of send a woman back to her home and say, this is your husband, don't, ruin the family by leaving him or whatever. And that was kind of a common approach. We see much less of that now, at least in Yerevan. In the regions, it's slower to change, but in Yerevan, we have a very good working relationship with that police department, and things are changing. I mentioned that there was an internal order put through to change the risk assessment procedures. They're very open to collaboration. We last year or 2 years ago drafted police procedures. And so this is like a collaboration that we have with them. Before 2020, there were, I can't tell you the exact figure, but maybe 5% of cases were referred to us, or maybe at most 10% were referred to us by the police. And now 50% of our shelter cases are direct referrals from the police. So they are doing their job better than they did before, but there's still problems. There's still gender insensitivity, and there's still victim blaming, and we still see those things. So, but I wanted to say that things are slowly changing for the better.
Right. And it seems like it's only been a few years, and it's been also a catastrophic few years for the country, just in terms of everything that's been going on. So you mentioned some of these big moments with COVID, as you said, universally, unfortunately, the cases of domestic violence in this country and in other countries that are seen to have maybe a more proactive approach to domestic violence. You've seen that skyrocket, and then suppose adding a war to it. I did want to ask about kind of the gender dynamic of the war, and knowing that a lot of people have been widowed, and if you're seeing that in Armenia as having impacted some of the culture around women kind of having to work, having to especially in the regions, really having to fend for themselves, or is it still early days?
I think it's too early to tell yet. Because even with the pandemic and the war, I mean, we were seeing cases kind of trickling in slowly over time, years after, they were impacted by these multiple crises. So I think it's still too early to tell whether that has had any impact or will have an impact on Armenia. It may.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard. It is hard to tell. And just as a kind of a grounding moment in terms of regionally, how Armenia compares domestic violence. Do you have any figures on that, or any sense of that? Like, is it more or less, or kind of a general average?
Well, if we're looking at the Caucasus, I mean, can't really trust figures coming out of Azerbaijan, to be honest. And with Georgia, I don't think it's that different than what Armenia has experienced. They're a little bit more advanced in that they've had specialist service providers and support longer than we've had, and they've had laws longer than we've had. But there are still issues, in Georgia. So I think regionally, it's still very prevalent.
Right, that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions here?
How would it compare with Lebanon?
I don't have those figures, to be honest with you, and I can't really tell. And my guess is that it's gotten a lot worse in recent years with everything going on in Lebanon.
I think Turkey has the highest rate of femicide in the world, if I'm not mistaken. But what I'm curious about is just on a region, how do you make yourselves visible or aware to the women in the region? Do you have a sort of a secret language code that you work with local hospitals and police officers to allow them the ability to reach out to you guys? How does that?
When we first were established, and like I mentioned, we were a small grassroots collective doing this work, we did advertise our services. We used the metro, we used campaigning. We slowly, became recognized as the premier center doing this work. And so we don't advertise, people kind of know where to find us. But that's not the case for the regions, because many of those centers, and these are also women's organizations doing this work, many of them have only been established for 2 or 3 years at this point. Some have been established a lot longer. So we do need to increase visibility to make sure that women in the regions know where to go, because some of them would be more likely to go to their local provider, right, than come to Yerevan. That being said, the services are provided by women's NGOs that are also doing other work with women. Like they're also offering economic empowerment programs. They're also working to campaign, and many of them have other projects that are not related to domestic violence. So that helps women come to their centers, because if their centers were only known as domestic violence centers, they might be targeted, or, communities are small out there. But because they also do other work, it could be likely that they were going for a workshop to enhance their skills, in other areas. So this is how those centers function now. And I will say more and more women are coming out to support, more and more women are reporting domestic violence and coming out to the regional centers more than ever before. So we are getting the word out, but we need to enhance visibility. Absolutely.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing, because I remember you spoke about campaigns. I remember one of the campaigns in 2015 that was done, again, in collaboration with the Women's Resource Center, was to essentially, in the main square in Haraparak, put out shoes
Yeah.
And kind of representing the amount of women that have been abused, and people would walk by and there would be statistics on the floor, and there were children's shoes as well, and things like that. And I remember most clearly when people would walk by, a lot of the older women, when you spoke to them, would say things like, well, people don't just get hurt for no reason, right?
Mhm.
Like there must be something that you would have done to deserve
Yeah.
that. And it seems like even that understanding, and that the blame is shifting more towards the people who are actually perpetrating the violence.
Yes and no. I mean, it is
Yeah.
changing, but the last statistic I read on this, a recent survey that came out, still said that about 50% of people tolerate domestic violence, meaning that not tolerate it, but adhere to those same myths that a woman caused it or so forth. So there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard. It has improved, at least in Yerevan. Absolutely. Societal awareness generally of this issue has improved quite considerably in just the last decade.
So I wanted to ask about, well, actually, Natasha, maybe you can go ahead.
For children, specifically boys, because I find that there's a lot of work done to educate women, but there's not enough, and this is globally, I find, to educate boys on, which is why I think you're seeing such a shift of, because there is a huge threat now of people kind of regressing back into women hating mode. You're seeing this massive trend reoccurring, and I think a lot of that is because men are not, we're kind of being taught, and they're just still being kept in these traditional values, being raised on these traditional values. And are there any such programs that kind of target this issue from at least a young age? And if there are, how open are their parents to them?
There are one-off programs that NGOs put out and to, advance this issue, or to invite youth, women, girls and boys together to learn about violence against women and gender equality. There's also at a state level a course called Healthy Lifestyles, which is offered from, now it's starting in 6th grade all the way to 12th grade. Issues with this specific course is that it's never really been properly evaluated. And I know that there are some positive changes that have been made to the curricula to improve the curricula, but the issue still resides with the fact that some of the educators who are chosen to lead these classes are not properly prepared. These are usually biology teachers or phys ed teachers who are doing this course. And it's not just on domestic violence and sex ed. It deals with other issues as well, like substance abuse and making essentially life skills, making good decisions and so forth. But yeah, there is still an issue with how this course is being taught. They're not graded on it. It's not being evaluated. So a lot needs to change. It has to start from the school. Also, it has to start with the family, but it has to start in the school, because whatever they're not learning in the home, at least, there's this other source of information coming to them. So yeah, there are some one-off programs. There's this state program that I mentioned, but not enough is being done to engage youth and boys in particular.
I wanted to ask in relation to some of the perceptions of this type of work, that it is maybe an incursion on Armenian culture, that it's a Western kind of feminist thing, that it's there. I remember quite a lot of dialogue around, oh, it's not native, right? This is not an indigenous-led effort.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the demographics of the women who staff these centers and the people who are actually involved in these initiatives?
Yes. I mean, these are primarily local initiatives that are led by locals. At our center, our director herself is diasporan, I'm diasporan, but we have a 22-member staff and everyone else is local. I mean, this is really, this is not a Western imposed issue, right? This is an issue that we deal with worldwide. And I think we're starting to tackle that stereotype as well, that, of course, there are people who are going to say that, this is an incursion on the family values and that rhetoric. But I think more and more people are recognizing that this is a human rights issue, and it needs to be dealt with as a human rights issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a question in the chat. Yeah, Susan, would you want to read it out? Because I feel like I might not be getting the last one here.
Another question here, I think it's also from, oops, I lost the name now, but if we see a situation where there's violence against women, how can we denounce it in an efficient way? And it reminded me of, I don't know if you've noticed on the tubes, there are these posters that if you see somebody
Yeah.
mistreating a woman in some way or shape, what do you do? What do you do? Do you interfere? Do you
Yeah.
take them aside? Or
I mean, this is a very tricky situation
it's
because
also worldwide.
yeah, it's a worldwide issue, and a lot of it comes down to personal safety as well. And you know, there are a lot of cases that we've had in Armenia where there were women who were beaten, who were even murdered in homes where neighbors were listening to it. So you know, I don't know, intervening, you know, might be too strong of a word in the sense that putting your own body in danger, but absolutely one could call the police and could notify. And I think at a lower level, you know, just talking about it, normalizing it, speaking about the issues around gender equality and violence against women, just as a society member, doing your job and your due diligence to kind of crack those myths and stereotypes and those harmful gender norms. That in and of itself is also crucial, right, in doing something about this issue. But yeah, we definitely need more response from society. People have been too passive and too permissive of this. We need to collectively stand up and say no to this.
A couple of things. One is how is it working with government? Because to my mind, I think what you've achieved in 13 odd years is very impressive. If you consider that Spain only criminalized violence against wives, what was it, 20 or something years ago?
Yeah.
The sort of movement has been quite big. Leapfrogging, as Nana said. But so how easy is it to work with government? How receptive? And you say 2017, so what was it like with previous government, current government?
Yeah.
And then also, you talked about in the case of, I think it was her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And I remember years ago we used to talk, and do you remember there was a video and there was a lot of older women talking about who were sort of not against violence. So how do you deal with that kind of, what do you guys do with those sorts of situations where you have actual women who don't support their daughter-in-laws or children who are suffering, who are actually hurting?
Yeah. I mean, mother-in-law abuse is unfortunately a reality in Armenia. It's something that we see happen quite frequently, if not physical, then the emotional abuse, right, from the mothers-in-law. And this also has to do with the fact that they live in a traditional household and the mother-in-law also adheres to these harmful norms, you know. So this is an unfortunate reality that women live with, and not only being abused by husbands, but also mothers-in-law. It's very common, and it's very hard because a lot of women, especially in more conservative communities, are told by even their parents that, you know, they should stay, they should try to work out their marriage, because there's a lot of stigma associated with divorced women. And it's something that no woman wants to do, right? So it's challenging. I don't know if I can answer your question as to what we do. I mean, we offer support for victims who come to us, no matter what the abuse is that they experienced. And often it's not just experienced by one member of the household or intimate partner, but others as well. What was the first question? Working with government. Yeah. We have developed a good working relationship, and things did change for the better since the revolution, because there were more people who are advocates now in government and working with us and willing to work with us on this issue. I mentioned that there were 3 members of parliament who came together to take a leading role on, right, establishing this package of amendments. So that's something we're seeing now that we didn't see before. There's a lot more action on this issue. And there's also a lot more international pressure from the EU and from other actors who are really interested to see this issue being tackled in Armenia. So they're getting pressure also from the international community to make change in this. And they have. Our relationship with the state has changed over time. And we always say it was a battle on the streets. We used to take to the streets with, banners, and now we're sitting at roundtable sessions with government actors, but it's still the same fight, and we're doing that work. And our approach has been kind of more moderate, that we feel that we have to work to create institutional change. We have to work with those actors, key decision makers in government, and we have done that. And now we're even chosen by the ministry to implement a nationwide program. So this kind of goes to show that the relationship and the collaboration has improved over time. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about media earlier, and there's like different kind of telenovelas, your cave dramas, you have your Turkish dramas now, which is going to become Turkey's biggest export and a huge influencer. There's one reoccurring theme through all of these, which is, again, women are treated badly. The whole scenario is always built up on a woman either in poverty or wealth. I mean, we see now less of being put in a poverty and just being mistreated until she proves herself and proves she's a good person. What efforts are being made to put pressure on the media? Because I understand that this is being filled with entertainment, but the problem is that it only reinforces violence against women. And what's interesting is when you watch all of these dramas, which are all mostly available on YouTube, when you look at the comments, you'll see people are like, I love this show and I can't wait for the moment that she finds her vindication. So what efforts are there, if you know of any, in any genre? It doesn't have to just be in like Armenian media, but just across the world, and trying to shift and move away from this kind of plot scenarios?
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm not sure that I'll be able to fully answer it. I know that, working with networks and coalitions, that this is something we always make public statements around when we see it, because representations in media, like you said, are so important to societal perceptions around violence against women. So whenever we see some egregious soap opera or something being put out, we make statements, we complain, we do raise our voices about it. But at a higher level, I'm not sure that a lot is being done to tackle this issue, but I'm also not probably the best person to answer that question.
This is a sort of offbeat question. What's the percentage of female police officers?
Great question. I don't know the percentage offhand, but there are a lot of female police officers now. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're more gender sensitive. But we have found, in our trainings that often women are more perceptive to it, or at least acknowledge that the issue exists. When we first started doing police trainings, there was a lot of pushback, against. And I remember, we put together a very comprehensive training program, and then we realized we had to scrap it and kind of go to the basics of what is domestic violence, what are the 4 main forms of domestic violence. Like, we had to start there because there was so much kind of pushback, around this even existing in the first place, right? But yeah, no, we've come a long way, and it's not necessarily true that, women are more, but we do see that they're more sensitive often to this issue.
We've got big problems in London right now.
Yeah.
So
And that was run by a woman.
And another question, what is potential threat to the work that you do, given the current situation with Azerbaijan? Because we're seeing now that, the likelihood of war in Armenia, it could be a reality. How would that affect?
Yeah.
And have you got any measures in place?
We have learned from the war, kind of, we took action, and so we have certain kind of institutional things in place. But I think, unfortunately, what we might expect is another mass influx of people coming into Armenia and having to take on that burden of providing essential services and delivering goods to all of those families. It's a very, it's a reality that we might have to deal with. I mentioned that we work with a network of regional domestic violence support centers. A lot of those regions took in many of the displaced families. And collectively, we served about 7,000 families since 2020. And, our partners in Godis and Goldijk, they're probably going to take the brunt of it if that were to happen. It's really hard to say at this point. I think we're kind of collectively holding our breaths, to see what would happen next. I will say there has to be more in place at an institutional level, because we learned the last time that we weren't prepared for such an emergency. There were issues with hotline calls. There were issues all across the board with just organizational issues. I hope that we've learned some of those lessons so that we're better prepared, but it's really hard to tell at this point what to expect.
Yeah. I was going to ask about kind of the network of institutions or in civil society that you all work with, similarly situated organizations and things like that. But I did want to kind of go back to the police for a little bit. I know that recently there's been an introduction of a new police force, which I suppose might go some way to integrating more women. But as you said, I think that the kind of false equivalence of more women equals more rights for women is not always there. But just going back to that initial question, I suppose, of what are the organizations that you work with that are kind of focusing on gender rights in the country that we should all kind of be aware of or should keep an eye on?
The other civil society organizations. I already mentioned the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women. That's a network of, I believe, 11 organizations doing this work. We also took a leading role recently in establishing a coalition among our regional support centers. So we're the Coalition of Domestic Violence Support Centers, and we came together as a unified force to take on more of an advocacy role, because we're the organizations that actually deliver essential domestic violence services. So from that perspective and that vantage point, we have a unique kind of ability to see all of the various legal gaps and choose certain points that we want to focus on to improve the situation for women in the country. So our coalition is made up of all of those regional support centers that I mentioned, and we're really focused on now putting together advocacy messages to improve legislation, policies, and also the implementation of these policies.
Right. That's fabulous. I thought, Susan, you raised your hand. Before I suppose we come to the end of our time together, I did want to ask you what has been personally and professionally the most challenging part of working in this field. And then also what has been the most positive thing that you've experienced?
Well, I have to say the real heroes of this work are the social workers and the psychologists and lawyers who are on the front lines every single day doing this. I have the advantage of doing more of the administrative work, which, is a little bit on the sidelines, helping the center function and keep running. But it's really our staff, our specialist staff, who are really at the front lines doing this. What's the hardest part? I think, especially this is talking to before 2017, frustrations around things, feeling like they were taking so long, not having a law, not having measures in place, frustrations around the insensitivity of, service providers and other people doing this work, and kind of the lack of impetus to really do anything. And I think that really has been and is still a big challenge. I think I try to take a step back and look at the big picture, because I mentioned to you, what we've done in just 13 years, and it really is incredible under the leadership of Maro and our staff. But when you're in it, it sometimes feels like it's just going at such a slow pace, So I think that frustration for sure. And then the positive is just seeing those success stories, seeing people like Hasmi come in, hearing about women who were absolutely devastated and, at the brink of ending their lives. And now they're professionals, living independent and successful lives free of abuse. Seeing those women, hearing their stories just helps us all keep going, I think.
Yeah. Tell us about how we can support the Women's Support Center or initiatives, this varied set of initiatives in Armenia.
Yeah. So we always accept donations. Things have become so challenging now, given all the socioeconomic impacts of the war in Ukraine. Things are increasingly expensive. So if you can imagine running 2 shelters now, prices of food, of everything have just risen dramatically. So we're always happy to accept donations, which by check, by PayPal, anything. And we're also open to collaborating with people who want to make a difference in the lives of women and victims of domestic violence. We have volunteers and interns come to us, people who are specialized and offer special trainings for our staff. So if there is any interest in engaging with the center, please feel free to reach out to me and we can work out a plan.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. That I think the diaspora feels, at least before all of this happened, before the last few years, I certainly felt from the diaspora that there are pockets that were very supportive of women's rights and moving that forward. And maybe that was a bias because I was so interested in it that I attracted people in that same realm. But
no, if it wasn't for diasporans who believed in our mission, we wouldn't be able to do this work that we're doing now. About 50% of our funding still comes from diasporans and the other 50% from foundations and grants. And a few very generous donors have allowed us to establish our shelters and to do the work that we're doing. So it really is so important. And this is an issue that as diasporans and as Armenians, we should be interested in and working toward combating, because domestic violence, like I mentioned, it's a human rights issue, and we all want to see a harmonious Armenia that is free from violence.
Yeah. On that note, I think it's time to thank you for coming, honey, for coming all this way.
Thank you for
for
having me. It's
talking.
really been so nice.
Thank you all for joining us. Before I sign off, especially for the folks who are joining us from Armenia, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that the Armenian Institute does do events, and you can check us out on our website and also on our social media platforms. It's Facebook and Instagram. We are really grateful for your support and really grateful for all the conversations that we can have. So thank you, Annie.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
your time.